Well, welcome everyone to this evening at ASPI. Our guest tonight is Michèle Coninsx, who heads the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate. She's been in that job for 2 years, and before that she had long experience in the administration of justice at a national level in her native Belgium, and then in the development of justice policy in Europe generally. And Michèle has specialised in methods to deal with terrorism in aviation. Hers is a key role in the structure of the United Nations as a crucial international body which states that violent extremism is an affront to its purposes and principles, that it undermines peace and security, human rights and sustainable development, and that no country or region is immune from its impacts. Michèle is in Australia at a time when we're having considerable debate over aspects of our counter-terrorism legislation and whether we should allow foreign fighters or their wives and children back into our country. It'll be interesting to hear what Michèle's got to say about some of these issues. So welcome to Australia. My name is Brendan Nicholson. I'm the Defence Editor of ASPI's Strategist publication, online publication. It's a commentary site, which no doubt many of you will be familiar with. So Michèle, how important is the role of the United Nations in setting international standards and establishing policies and practice to counter terrorism and violent extremism?
Good evening. The role of the United Nations is, of course, first and foremost to support the member states in their efforts to counter terrorism and violent extremism. And the more terrorism is evolving and the landscape, threat landscape and the risk landscape is evolving, we see that this fight against terrorism and the countering of violent extremism becomes a global fight. Hence, through the establishment of different international instruments, conventions, Security Council resolutions, and establishment of a global counterterrorism strategy, United Nations try to stipulate guidance. Why guidance? Because of the global nature of the threat, we need a coherent, a holistic, comprehensive approach. So in support of the member states' efforts at local, at national level and at regional level, United Nations need to give support to the member states in that fight against terrorism and violent extremism. And more needed to do this also and including at global international level. Right.
Given that the Islamic State terror group, or Daesh, has lost its caliphate, do you believe that the organisation still poses a threat, and how big a threat?
Well, only this year, USG Voronkov and myself presented the 8th and the 9th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by Daesh and ISIL. This is a co-production of our two organizations, OCT and CTAD, but also co-produced by the Analytical Support and monitoring team, the so-called 1267 team, which is the threat analyst of the United Nations. Well, we said at two occasions, in spite of the defeat of Daesh, in spite of the losses, the territorial losses, they are not that yet. They still are forceful. They are using ICT massively, misusing ICT for terrorist purposes, and they still have the right funding. That coupled with the phenomenon we all know and confronted with of returning and relocating foreign terrorist fighters make them still a threat to international peace and security. And we are not only talking about Daesh and ISIL, we'll also talk about other terrorist organizations. We're talking about Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorist organizations, what I call alliance of opportunities between different terrorist groups, criminal groups, armed groups, makes the threat a serious, a complex threat, which is definitely not over. So what we said at the end of our presentation last August, we need, again, a comprehensive, holistic approach, and we need to be on top innovative, creative, and proactive. And so there is no need for complacence, no need for relaxation, because their objective, and especially when we talk about ISIL, Daesh, is to reinforce Islam worldwide. And that goal will not be given up.
Do you have any idea how many Daesh people there are still, or where they are, where they're getting their funding from?
Well, if I would know this figure, I would be Madame Soleil and would have a crystal ball, and I don't have it. I would like to have it because it's by knowing the extent of a problem that you can address the problem, and I think that no one has it. We, of course, at CTAT do have an ongoing dialogue with the 193 member states. And we really interview the member states on all the CT measures taken, on how many terrorist organizations they have on their soil, on how many fighters went to the conflict zones, how many returned. But the figures, of course, are worth where they are worth. And we really don't know, in the current geopolitical context, know what is going on in the conflict zones and in what extent there is movement from those known conflict zones to other regions.
You'll attend the No Money for Terror ministerial conference this week. Australians and our close neighbours, the New Zealanders, have seen the horrors of terrorism from both ends of the spectrum, Islamist terrorism and right-wing terrorism. We'd like to hear your views on the scale of the terrorist threat globally, and do you think it's likely to increase?
Well, let me first allow to commend Australia for hosting this second conference, No Money for Terror, because that's a golden opportunity for the decision makers at ministerial level to get together to make policy work, not only between the finance ministers, but also between the home affairs, the justice ministers, to have really informed discussions and decisions. And it's the second in a row. The first one was being organized by the French authority. So that's certainly a very good initiative. Why? Because of the reason I just have referred to, the fact that funding, financing of terrorism organization is so important to tackle. And Daesh, ISIL still has its resources necessary to inspire or to direct terrorist attacks at the large scale. So yes, that is a very good initiative. Now, in what extent we manage to reduce the threat of terrorism and violent extremism, not sure that this is done tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, because it's taking in different forms and it's becoming more and more complex every single day. It doesn't stop, it will not stop. Thinking that it will stop is a big illustration of naivety. And so, yes, we need to continue to be alert. We need to be vigilant, and only talking about the threat of returning and relocating foreign terrorist fighters has already required full attention at the level of the United Nations through Security Council Resolution 2396. We have been developing guiding principles at the level of the Security Council CTC, 18 guiding principles which are a sort of a support guiding to the 193 member states. And without going into much detail, but without taking the risk of oversimplifying, they're meant to identify returning, transiting, and relocating foreign terrorist fighters at the earliest stage possible. Why is that identification so important? In fact, in order to assess, to assist, protect, prosecute, rehabilitate, reintegrate those persons, all categories of persons moving, FDFs, families, and those linked to terrorist organizations. But it's equally important to have international cooperation, to have prosecution and rehabilitation, reintegration with a age-sensitive and a gender-sensitive approach, which is not that easy. Also to talk about the evidence, digital evidence, battlefield evidence. How do we get tangible, concrete evidence in order to secure prosecutions which touch the ground and are in full respect of the rule of law and fair trial? How to protect the soft targets or vulnerable targets or religious places of worship or sports events that is asking for public-private partnership. How do you build up those strategies and action plans? We need guidance. We offer guidance to the member states. Equally important, how to protect the critical infrastructure and how to reduce the illicit trafficking of small and light weapons in the context of terrorism. In a nutshell, and without oversimplifying, these are guidelines which were discussed with the 50 member states of Security Council, enlarge with other member states, civil society, private sector, and other players. So every single word has been discussed, been decided, has been agreed upon. This is a product we share with the rest of the world. So yes, that's the kind of work we have been doing, because the scourge, the threat related to foreign terrorist fighters is a serious one. And it doesn't stop at that level. It's not only by focusing on the returning foreign terrorist fighters, by focusing on the prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration, that we have solved the entire problem, as you all know.
Well, the very nature of foreign fighters, I suppose, makes it an absolutely classic global problem, doesn't it? It's your organisation has access to probably the best information in the world, one would presume. What sort of technologies do you think that terrorists might embrace in the future?
Well, it's a very relevant question. We have to understand the present to better be prepared for the future. And there are emerging trends which say that there might be a use of, for instance, UAS, unmanned aerial systems, so-called drones, for terrorist purposes. We have seen it for the use of internet, digital technology, weaponization of things by sole terrorists, lone wolves, using knives, cars, lorries, the weaponization of internet, the weaponization of social media. Maybe one day we will be confronted with the weaponization of drones over crowded places against critical infrastructure. The weaponization of AI, 3D print documents, all weapons, CBRN, to mention a few of them, or a combination of all these new threats. And so we need to dig into that area, and we need to step up our cooperation with the private sector, where a lot of information is being retained and come out on top. Because if we don't do this, the pace with which terrorist organizations might seize opportunities might be overwhelming.
Is there any likelihood of them trying at least to get hold of some sort of weapon of mass destruction, like radiological weapons or chemical weapons?
Well, CBRN is one of our concerns, especially biological and chemical weapons. The expertise must be shared where it is, and hence the importance of multidisciplinary approaches. Defense, home, justice must collaborate in order to share knowledge, know-how, experience, expertise. We have, for instance, at CTAT launched recently a trans alert on the drones problem, how to look at the potential risks of drones. We had a closed event at the CTC Security Council, and we continue to liaise with what we call the GRN, the Global Research Network, which is a network established in 2015 and reuniting more than 100 think tanks, universities and research institutes, to be sure that we don't miss any news, any new information, and that we step up our know-how and experience and share it with the rest of the world.
Yeah. We already saw in around Mosul, I understand, Islamic State using commercial, sort of off-the-shelf, almost toy drones, which are pretty sophisticated, to attack coalition and Iraqi forces. It does seem almost too easy.
Well, that's exactly what we have to be prepared for. It has been used for footage, propaganda, so far only for disruptive reasons, not for destructive reasons. But we cannot exclude that scenario. Let's get prepared is the answer.
Yeah. Now, a large number of members of the Islamic State terror group and their wives and families have been detained in the Middle East, and many of them came from foreign countries. There's been a mixed reaction from their home nations when it comes to accepting them back. Does the UN have a view, and do you yourself have a view, on whether individual nations should take them back?
We have been confronted at the United Nations, especially the Secretary General has been confronted with quite a huge amount of questions from the member states, requests from the member states. Can you help us? Can you support us? What is the best way forward? It's about how can we reduce the fueling of radicalization if we leave persons in very inhumane circumstances in all kinds of camps, detention camps, refugee camps, IDP camps. What do you think will happen? What will be the fueling of radicalization? We don't know, but we can guess that this might be a fueler of radicalization. And we have to think short, mid, and long term. The problem is that we don't know what's happening in the camps, that we don't have full insight in what's happening in the camps, but we also know that the two most concerned countries are not in a position to take care of all those present on their territory. So that is asking for some approach. And the Secretary General took an initiative under his auspices. He reunited different UN entities and asked us to make a note called the key principles on the approach for families linked to terrorist organizations in the conflict zones, including in relation to foreign terrorist fighters. And he is urging for a child-based approach. The child in the first place needs to be protected, need to be assisted. He's also asking to look in at the situation of women, and that's exactly what we have been doing at CTAT. When you look at the roles of women, you need to be very, very nuanced. A woman might have been traveled to conflict zones for terrorist reasons, for criminal reasons, as facilitator, as supporter, as an inciter, a recruiter, but for the same price, a woman can have traveled to the conflict zones as a victim. Can become a victimized victim or can have different roles. Start as a victim and end up as an actor, start as an actor, come back as a victim, or, and that's I think something we cannot neglect, be an active agent of prevention. So we have to look at every single case individually, and that is making this fight and this situation so complex. For a complex problem and a global problem, more than thousands and thousands of people left more than 110 member states, it's a huge number, for going to the conflict zones. We will have to look at every single individual case at its merit. And that's the reason why I said it's so important to identify every single case and person, to assess, so it's important to have an assessment management, assist, protect, prosecute, rehabilitate, reintegrate. So for a global problem, we need a tailored approach. And there is no such a thing as a one-size-fits-all. If we go for a one-size-fits-all, we end up with a one-size-fits-no-one, which is not an option. So it's not possible to say, you have to do this or that, but guidance, key principles say that we need to think about how to reduce the radicalization in the member states, in the conflict zones, and how can we approach the problem. And we have seen, and we all know it, we also know it through our dialogues with the member states we have ongoing, that there are different approaches. Some countries have prioritized the repatriation of children. Some only orphans. Some say that they don't repatriate, but do repatriate children under 10 years. Then start to repatriating the children between 10 and 14 years. Some countries only repatriate the children with their mothers. Some countries say, no, we don't know if the children are our children. The identification is not an easy exercise. And for the women, we see also different approaches. Now, my office has launched an analytical brief on the repatriation of women and the repatriation of children on the basis of open sources or ongoing dialogue with the member states, and also based on research work by the think tanks. So have a look at our website and you will discover that analytical brief. But it's only based on the previous 12 months, and we have seen that there is a growing engagement since July and August. More repatriation for children, less appetite for repatriation of women. Again, every single national state will decide on the basis of national sovereignty. If we would have the key solution, the magic solution, well, we would most probably not work at the United Nations or work somewhere else. But it is for sure true that we're working on the mapping of different practices and at a certain moment, based on disaggregated figures, analyze, be in a position to say what happened in different states, what will lead to solutions, and not to be neglected to think about post-repatriation strategies, short, mid, and long term. It will be equally important to take care about those, not only those who return on their own accord, but those who have been repatriated, if they are repatriated. We also see, and that's a growing concern, and not being based on research, so we have to be prudent with what we say, is that the perception at the level of the member states by family members that nothing is being done to assist their family members in the conflict zones starts to fuel also radicalization. So that's something we have to keep in mind. We have seen some countries where complaints were filed against states for non-assistance to people in need, so we have to follow up that trend as well. So you touch on one single issue and you see that there are different consequences. No, we don't have the solution. No, we don't impose. We try to guide, map approaches and see at the end on an evidence-based manner what is leading to successes.
You've explained the complexity of it all very eloquently. Like a country like Australia, I think, is naturally a fairly caring and generous, or has a fairly caring and generous population. But the views of, well, our exposure to the impact of this whole terrorist episode on the individuals involved probably began with a photograph that was widely published of the child of one of our most noted Islamic State members holding the heads of two beheaded Syrian soldiers. Now, at the other end of the scale, you've had considerable sympathy for grandmothers who've gone to the region to rescue their grandchildren. And that's gained considerable sympathy. How much education of the population is needed, and what sort of resources need to be put into it by governments to actually explain to their populations all of the complexities that you just explained?
Mm-hmm. I think we need to create awareness. The public at large needs to be informed, and needs to be informed completely and correctly. And again, every single case needs to be looked at its merits and individually and case by case. As you rightfully said, children sometimes even born in the conflict zones, brought to the conflict zones, might be victims, but might also be trained to become killing machines. So again, every single case has to be assessed individually, as is the case for women, whatever their age might be. We have seen in this region terrorist attacks committed by a whole family of returning foreign terrorist fighters. So one doesn't exclude the others, but it is extremely important that we concentrate on counter-narrative, both online and offline, and that we do it with all layers of society, and hence the importance of having a whole of government and a whole of society approach, making an appropriate use of the religious leaders, of the families, of the schools, of all possible players, civil society, NGOs, because all of us do have some piece of the keys of the solutions, and no one has the only key to the solution. And that's something we have to make sure that this message comes through. Mm-hmm. National counterterrorism strategies and national counter-violent extremism strategies do take this element on board. It's not only the work of one segment, one entity. It is really the work and the responsibility of each and every single individual person of society. Hence, informing them is extremely important.
Given that responsibility, do you believe that nations have a responsibility to bring home these people, good or bad?
Well, as I said, this is really the national sovereignty. Every single country, region has to look at the threat and the risk and to take measures which are in line and based on that assessment of the risk and the threat. And that's really the sovereignty of a nation. We, United Nations, do not replace nations. We support nations and we might come to the fore with guidance, recommendations. We do not replace the decisions of the national states. It is state ownership.
Yeah, the United Nations, through Resolution 2482, has focused on the nexus between terrorism and organised crime. How dangerous is that threat? Is it a reality?
Well, it is in fact under the Peruvian chairmanship that this new Security Council resolution saw the daylight in July this year. We have seen that there were assumptions that there were links between the two, but we never really saw, when we had dialogues with the member states, that there was also proof, illustrations, through convictions, through prosecutions. And hence we see that there is an alliance of opportunities. They do connect with each other. They do copycat each other, or they have sometimes a criminal past. Look at the 11 March 2004 attacks in Madrid. 292 people were killed. The heart of Europe, those were in fact criminal gangs involved in drug trafficking who made the step towards terrorist attacks. And we have seen that in some countries the criminal gangs ask fines or money to transpass some roads in order to continue their work. It is some kinds of alliance they have, some kinds of transactional link they have. If we do not create synergies between investigations and prosecutions, dig into both and continue to work in silos, we will never be able to have prosecutions, solid prosecutions, which are tackling both. As a former prosecutor, we know that some of the successes of terrorist cases are entirely based on the use of special techniques, which are not that elaborated as for organized crime gangs. So it will be good to make use of special investigative techniques as much as possible and to spread that good news, to intensified international cooperation and to look at both sides of the coin because they might be interlinked, and not to seize and not to lose any opportunity, in fact, to be successful.
Now, your committee looks at the role of gender. Have you examined that?
Sure.
And what are your views? Where does gender actually fit into terrorism?
Well, it is an integral part of our assessment work. In all our dialogues, we have the gender sensitive approach as a crossing issue. In what extent are women driven to become radicalized? What are the drivers of radicalization? What is the best way of making use of women in a counter-violent extremism context? In what extent can you ask women to be part of the strategy, be it counter-terrorism, CVE strategy? How can you make use of them in order to monitor and evaluate the success of your strategy? So they might have different roles to play. Also at the highest political decision making, do women have a role to play? Can they push for policy decision making and ensure that every single layer of society, that means youth, men, and women, can play their role? So the gender-sensitive approach is an integral part of our dialogues. So yes, and not later than last Friday, we had an open meeting in the United Nations where we brought together different experts to highlight the importance of the gender-sensitive approach. And I think in April, we launched a trans report on the gender dimension of the returning foreign terrorist fighters. So yes, it's certainly in our radar. We work hand in hand with UN Women, for instance. We have our own gender expert at CTAT. So it's a cross-cutting issue and an important issue.
And is that looking at the involvement of each gender in terrorism or in countering terrorism?
Well, both. Both. We see both active without distinction. So you need a counterweight which is acting with the same pace and in the same cooperative way. Thank you.
And thanks very much. Yeah.